I pulled into my driveway in Willow Creek Estates Landing, Columbus, Ohio, and saw the bright orange violation notice flapping under my windshield wiper. My truck was not illegally parked. I had not left garbage cans out past collection day. I had not painted my front door an unapproved color. The notice said I was storing improper equipment in plain view. I looked in the truck bed. There was a snow shovel lying flat next to a bag of salt. That was it. I grabbed the notice and read it twice. The violation was issued by Priscilla Howard, Board Secretary, and it referenced Section 12-4 of the Community Covenant, which I knew by heart because I track every HOA fee and rule like a financial analyst tracks earnings reports. Section 12-4 covers commercial vehicles and trailers. A snow shovel is not a commercial vehicle. I moved to Willow Creek Estates Landing 6 months earlier because the mortgage was reasonable and my younger brother needed a place with accessible features after his car accident left him with permanent mobility issues. The neighborhood is a golf course community where status and appearances run everything. The HOA is aggressive. Priscilla Howard, who everyone calls Diane because she hates her first name, runs the paperwork side of the board, and she has made it clear from day one that she decides what counts as a violation and what does not. My brother depends on me. If they tow my truck or cut off my gate access, I cannot get him to physical therapy or grocery runs. The stakes are not abstract. I called the HOA office and got voicemail. I left a message asking for clarification. I texted my neighbor Greg, who sits on the landscaping committee and has been around long enough to know the backstory. He texted back in under a minute. Diane has been targeting your street all winter. 3 other houses got violations last week for minor stuff. She wants people to sell cheap so her golf buddies can buy in. I asked if he was serious. He said absolutely serious. I asked if he would put that in writing. He said he would think about it. I went inside and checked the covenant. Section 12-4 does not mention shovels. It does not mention hand tools. It mentions commercial signage, business equipment, and trailers over a certain length. A shovel does not qualify. I took photos of the truck bed from 4 angles. I took a photo of the notice. I took a screenshot of Section 12-4. Then I went back outside and moved the shovel into the garage. I was not going to give Diane an easy excuse to escalate. The next morning I got an email from the HOA management company. The email said my appeal was denied and I had 72 hours to remove the improper equipment or face a $50 daily fine. I replied with the photos and the covenant text. I pointed out that a shovel is not equipment storage under any reasonable interpretation. The reply came back in 30 minutes. The board secretary has reviewed your appeal and determined that the shovel constitutes a visual nuisance under the discretionary authority granted in Section 2-9. I looked up Section 2-9. It said the board may address aesthetic concerns on a case-by-case basis. It was the kind of vague language that lets an HOA do whatever it wants. I called Greg. He answered on the second ring. I told him what happened. He said Diane is using discretionary authority to hammer anyone she does not like. I asked if he would go on record. He said he would write a statement, but he could not testify at a board meeting because he works with Diane on other committees. I said a written statement was enough. He said he would email it to me by the end of the day. That afternoon the temperature started climbing. The forecast said it would hit 40 degrees by evening and drop back to 20 overnight. I needed to document the snow melt pattern around my property line before it refroze into a new shape. Diane had been taking photos of my front steps every time a delivery driver splashed water and it froze into ice patches. She was building a case that I was creating hazardous conditions. If I did not capture the current melt state, she could claim the ice was my fault instead of natural freeze and thaw. I grabbed my phone and walked the perimeter. I took video of the driveway runoff, the sidewalk edge, the mailbox post, and the front steps. The melt was already starting. I had maybe 2 hours before the puddles refroze. I finished the documentation and went back inside. Greg's email was waiting. He had written 3 paragraphs describing how Diane had been selectively targeting homeowners on Fairway Drive, which was my street, with minor violations that would never be enforced on other streets. He said Diane had asked him in November if he knew anyone who wanted to buy on Fairway Drive cheap, and when he asked why, she said the board was going to make some examples. He said he was willing to sign the statement and share it with city enforcement if needed. I saved the email as a PDF and backed it up to 3 places. The next morning I woke up to a knock on the door. I looked through the peephole. It was Diane. She was wearing a royal blue puffer coat and a burgundy knit hat. Her black hair was pulled into tight curls. She was holding a thick ring binder with colored tabs sticking out. I opened the door. She did not say hello. She said, "I need your gate code and your mailbox key for an inspection." I said, "An inspection of what?" She said the board has discretionary authority to inspect common area access points. I said the gate code and mailbox are not common area access points, they are individual access credentials. She said, "I have witnesses, so do not lie to me." I said, "I am not lying, I am telling you what the covenant says." She said, "I decide what the truth is around here." I felt my pulse spike, but I kept my voice calm. I said, "I am not giving you my gate code or mailbox key without a written request that cites the specific covenant section." She said, "You have 24 hours or we will change your code and you will have to pay a reinstatement fee." Then she turned and walked back to her car. I closed the door and immediately texted Greg. I told him what just happened. He said, "She is trying to lock you out so you cannot get to your brother's appointments." I said, "That is exactly what I thought." He said, "Document everything and do not give her the codes." I said I already planned on that. Then I set up my doorbell camera to save all recordings to the cloud. That evening I checked my email. There was a message from the management company. It said the board had voted to suspend my amenity access pending resolution of the equipment storage violation. I replied and said the shovel has been in the garage for 2 days and I have photos proving compliance. The reply said the suspension stands until the board secretary confirms visual compliance. I knew what that meant. Diane was not going to confirm compliance until I gave her the gate code. I called the management company and got voicemail. I left a message explaining the situation and asking for an emergency board review. No one called back. The next day, I had to take my brother to physical therapy. I drove to the main gate and swiped my access card. The gate did not open. I tried again. Nothing. I backed up and tried the visitor lane. The intercom crackled, and a voice said, "State your name and purpose." I said, "I am a resident. My name is on file. My access card is not working." The voice said, "Your access has been suspended. You need to contact the management company." I said, "I need to leave right now for a medical appointment." The voice said, "I cannot override a suspension." I reversed out of the gate lane and drove around to the service entrance on the north side. That gate was keycard only, and it opened. I made a note to check if Diane knew about the service entrance. I got my brother to therapy on time. On the way back, I stopped at a print shop and made copies of Greg's statement, the covenant sections, the photos, and the email chain. I put everything in a folder. When I got home, there was another orange notice on my door. This one said I had parked in a fire lane. I looked at my driveway. I was parked in my own driveway, which is not a fire lane. The notice was dated that morning while I was gone. Diane had come by while I was out and posted a fake violation. I checked the doorbell camera footage. She had pulled up at 9:15, walked to my door, taped the notice, and then walked around the side of the house toward the backyard. I scrubbed through the footage. She had gone to the back fence and taken photos of my trash cans. The trash cans were inside the fence in the designated storage area. She was manufacturing violations. I called Greg again. I told him about the fake fire lane notice and the photos of the trash cans. He said, "You need to go to the city." I said I was planning on it, but I wanted to have everything documented first. He said, "Do not wait too long, she is escalating fast." I said, "I know." He said, "If she tries to tow your truck, call the police immediately." I said, "I will." That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the gate code demand and the fake violations. Diane was trying to make my life unlivable so I would sell and move. The problem was that I could not afford to move. I had just bought the place 6 months ago, and the market was soft. If I sold now, I would lose money, and I would have to find another accessible place for my brother, which was almost impossible in Columbus on short notice. I was stuck. The next morning, I drove to the City Code Enforcement Office. I brought the folder with all the documentation. The front desk clerk said I needed to file a complaint and wait for an inspector to review it. I said this is time sensitive The HOA is threatening to tow my vehicle, and I take care of a disabled family member. She said I understand, but the process takes time. I asked if I could speak to a supervisor. She said the supervisor was in a meeting. I left the folder and filled out a complaint form. The clerk said someone would call me within 3 business days. I went home and checked my email. There was a new message from the management company. It said a tow company had been authorized to remove my vehicle if it was found in violation of parking regulations. I replied and said I am parked legally in my own driveway and any tow attempt would be theft. The reply said the board has determined that your driveway use constitutes improper storage and the vehicle will be removed if not relocated to an approved parking area by 5 p.m. today. I looked at the clock. It was 11 a.m. I had 6 hours. I called the police non-emergency line. I explained the situation. The dispatcher said if a tow truck shows up and you believe the tow is not authorized, you can refuse and ask the driver to leave. If the driver refuses, call us back. I said, what if they tow it anyway? She said that would be theft and you can file a report. I said thank you. I hung up and called a local attorney who handles HOA disputes. The receptionist said the attorney was booked until next week, but she could squeeze me in for a 15-minute phone consult tomorrow morning. I said I might not have a truck by tomorrow morning. She said let me check. She put me on hold. 2 minutes later the attorney picked up. He said tell me what is happening. I gave him the short version. He said they cannot tow your vehicle from your own driveway without a court order unless the vehicle is abandoned or creating a hazard. I said it is not abandoned and it is not a hazard. He said then they are bluffing. If they try to tow it, document everything and call the police. I said I already planned on that. He said good. He said if this goes to a hearing you have a strong case for harassment. I said thank you. He said call me if it escalates further. I moved my truck to the street in front of my house. The street parking was legal and clearly marked. I took photos of the truck, the street signs, and the curb. Then I sat in my living room and watched through the window. At 3 p.m. a flatbed tow truck pulled up. The driver got out and looked at my truck. He pulled out his phone and made a call. I grabbed my phone and started recording video. The driver walked around the truck and took photos. Then he pulled out a clipboard and started filling out paperwork. I went outside. I said, can I help you? He said, I have an order to tow this vehicle. I said, from who? He said, Willow Creek Estates Landing HOA. I said, this is street parking. The HOA does not have authority over public streets. He said, my order says this vehicle is in violation of community parking rules. I said, show me the order. He handed me the clipboard. The order was signed by Priscilla Howard and it said the vehicle was parked in an unapproved area. I said this is a public street, not an HOA area. He said I am just doing my job. I said if you tow this vehicle I will file a police report for theft. He looked at me. He looked at his phone. He said let me call my dispatcher. The driver talked to his dispatcher for 2 minutes. Then he hung up. He said my dispatcher says we cannot tow from a public street without city authorization. I said that is correct. He said I am sorry for the confusion. He got back in his truck and drove away. I stood there shaking. I checked my phone. The video was still recording. I stopped it and saved it to the cloud. 10 minutes later, Diane pulled up in her car. She got out and walked straight toward me. She said you moved your truck to avoid the tow. I said I moved my truck to legal parking. She said you are in violation of community standards. I said this is a public street. The HOA does not have jurisdiction here. She said I have witnesses, so do not lie to me. I said what witnesses? She said multiple residents have complained about your vehicle. I said name one. She said I do not have to justify board decisions to you. I said you are not the board, you are the secretary. She stepped closer. She said listen very carefully. If you do not cooperate, I will make sure you never use the amenities again. I will make sure every contractor you hire is blocked at the gate. I will make sure your property is inspected every single week until we find enough violations to put a lien on your house. I decide what the truth is around here. I kept my phone in my pocket, but I had turned on the voice recorder before she arrived. I said, are you threatening me? She said, I am telling you how things work. Then she got back in her car and drove away. I went inside and listened to the recording. It was clear. She had threatened me with harassment and retaliation. I saved the audio file and sent copies to Greg and to my attorney. Greg texted back immediately. "This is gold. Take it to the city." I texted back and said I will. That evening I got a call from the city code enforcement supervisor. He said I reviewed your complaint and the documentation you provided. I said thank you. He said I also received a separate complaint from another resident about HOA overreach on your street. I said, was it Greg? He said I cannot disclose the complainant, but I can tell you that we are opening an investigation. I said, what does that mean? He said it means we will be sending an inspector to review the HOA's enforcement actions and determine if they are violating city code or fair housing regulations. I said, how long will that take? He said, a few weeks. I said, I do not have a few weeks. The HOA is threatening to tow my vehicle and cut off my access. He said if they attempt an illegal tow, call the police. If they cut off your access to common areas without cause, that may be a violation of your property rights and you should consult an attorney. I said I already did. He said good. He said in the meantime, document everything. I said I have been. He said then you are doing everything right. I hung up feeling slightly less panicked, but still trapped. The next day I had to take my brother to a follow-up appointment. I used the service entrance again. On the way back I saw a city snowplow clearing the main road. The plow left a massive berm of packed snow and ice across the entrance to Fairway Drive. The berm was 4 feet high and stretched the width of the intersection. I parked on the main road and called a contractor I know who does snow removal. I asked if he could clear the berm. He said, sure, I can be there in an hour. I said, great. He said, do I need HOA approval? I said, no, this is a city street and the berm is blocking access. He said, okay. The contractor showed up with a skid steer and started breaking up the berm. I stood on the sidewalk and recorded video. About 10 minutes into the job, Diane showed up. She parked her car at an angle blocking the contractor's exit path. She got out and started yelling. She said, you cannot remove that snow without board approval. The contractor stopped the skid steer and looked at me. I said, keep going, she does not have authority over city streets. Diane walked toward the skid steer. She said, if you continue, I will have you arrested for trespassing. The contractor looked at me again. I said, this is not HOA property, this is a public street, and the berm is a hazard. Diane pulled out her phone and took photos. She said, I am documenting this illegal work and you will both be fined. I said, go ahead. I walked closer and held up my phone. I said, I am documenting you blocking a contractor on a public street. She said, you do not have permission to film me. I said, I am on a public sidewalk filming activity on a public street. She turned to the contractor. She said, if you do not stop right now, I will make sure you never work in this neighborhood again. The contractor shut off the skid steer. He said, I am sorry, man, I cannot deal with this. He backed up the skid steer, maneuvered around Diane's car, and left. I stood there looking at the berm. It was still blocking half the street. I called the city public works department and filed a complaint about the berm. The clerk said a crew would clear it within 24 hours. I said thank you. Diane was still standing there. She said, you just cost yourself another violation. I said, for what? She said, for hiring an unauthorized contractor. I said the contractor was working on a city street. She said the entrance to Fairway Drive is an HOA-controlled access point. I said, no, it is not. Check the plat map. She said, I do not need to check anything. Then she got in her car and drove away. That night I reviewed all my footage and audio. I had video of the fake fire lane notice, video of the tow truck attempt, video of Diane blocking the contractor, and audio of her threatening me with harassment. I also had Greg's written statement and the covenant documentation. I did not tell Diane about the audio recording. I wanted her to think I only had video. If she tried to lie about what she said, I could play the audio and prove her wrong. That was my trump card. I was holding it back because I wanted her to commit to a false version of events in public before I revealed the truth. The next morning I got an email from the management company. It said I was being fined $200 for unauthorized snow removal and another $50 for the equipment storage violation that was still on record despite my compliance. I replied with photos proving the shovel had been in the garage for a week and pointed out that the snow removal was on a city street. The reply said the fines stand and I had 10 days to pay or the account would go to collections. I forwarded the email chain to my attorney. He replied within an hour. He said this is clear retaliation. If you want to fight this, we can file a complaint with the State Real Estate Commission and request a hearing. I said, how long would that take? He said months. I said, I do not have months. He said, then your best option is to keep documenting and wait for the city investigation to finish. I said, okay. That afternoon, the temperature started dropping again. The forecast said it would be back to 15 degrees by midnight and stay cold for the next week. The melt window was closing. I needed to finish documenting the property line before everything refroze. I went outside and took another round of video. The ice on my front steps had refrozen into smooth sheets. The driveway runoff had turned into ridges. The sidewalk edge was a skating rink. I recorded everything. While I was outside, a car I did not recognize pulled up. A man in his 50s got out. He was wearing a reflective vest and holding a clipboard. He said, "Are you the homeowner?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I am with the city inspection office. We are following up on a complaint about hazardous ice conditions." I said, "The ice is from natural freeze and thaw. I have video documentation showing the melt pattern." He said, "Can I see it?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the footage from the previous afternoon. He watched it. He said, "This looks like normal winter runoff." He walked around the property and took notes. He said, "I do not see any violations here." I said, "The HOA secretary has been photographing my steps and claiming I am creating hazards." He said, "Do you have proof of that?" I said, "Yes." I pulled up the doorbell camera footage showing Diane taking photos. He watched it. He said, "That is interesting." He said, "I will include this in my report." He handed me a card. He said, "If you have any other issues, call me directly." I said, "Thank you." That evening, Greg called me. He said, "I heard the city inspector came by." I said, "Yes, he did not find any violations." Greg said, "Good." He said, "I also heard Diane is planning to call an emergency board meeting to vote on revoking your HOA membership." I said, "Can they do that?" He said, "Technically no, but she is going to try." I said, "When?" He said, "Tomorrow night." I said, "I was not notified." He said, "That is because she is claiming it is an executive session." I said, "That is illegal." He said, "I know, but she is doing it anyway." I said, "Are you going to be there?" He said, "I cannot. I am not on the main board." I said, "Who else is on the board?" He said, "There are 5 members total. Diane, the president, the treasurer, and 2 at-large members." I said, "Do you think they will vote with her?" He said, "The president usually does whatever Diane says. The treasurer is more reasonable, but he does not like conflict. The at-large members are hard to predict." I said, "So it could go either way." He said, "Yes." I said, "Can I attend?" He said, "If you show up and demand to be heard, they legally have to let you speak." I said, "I will be there." The next night I drove to the community center where the board meetings are held. I brought my folder with all the documentation, my phone with the audio recording, and a printout of the relevant covenant sections. The meeting room was small and cold. Diane was sitting at the head table with the other board members. She saw me walk in, and her face went red. She said, "This is an executive session. Residents are not permitted." I said, "Executive sessions are only for personnel matters and legal consultations, and revoking my membership is neither." The president, a man in his 60s with gray hair, said, "We are discussing a compliance issue." I said, "Compliance issues must be heard in open session with notice to the affected homeowner." The president looked at Diane. She said, "He is not in compliance, so he does not have standing." I said, "I have been in full compliance for a week, and I have documentation." I held up the folder. The treasurer, a woman in her 40s, said, "Let him speak." The president said, "Fine. You have 5 minutes." I laid out the timeline. I showed the photos proving the shovel had been in the garage. I showed the email chain proving the HOA had fabricated violations. I showed the video of the tow truck attempt. I showed the video of Diane blocking the contractor. The board members looked at each other. Diane said, "None of that is relevant. The issue is whether he is creating a nuisance." I said, "I have video proof that you have been manufacturing violations." Diane said, "I do not care what you think you have." I said, "I also have audio proof." I pulled out my phone. Diane's face went pale. I said, would you like me to play the recording of you threatening me with harassment and retaliation? The president said, what recording? I said the recording from 3 days ago where Diane told me she would make sure I never use the amenities again and that she would inspect my property every week until she could put a lien on my house. The treasurer said, play it. I played the audio. The room went silent. Diane said, that is taken out of context. I said the context is that you threatened me because I would not give you my gate code. One of the at-large members, a man in his 50s, said, Diane, is that true? Diane said he is twisting my words. The at-large member said it sounded pretty clear to me. The president said we need to table this and consult with our attorney. Diane stood up. She said, I am not going to sit here and be attacked. She grabbed her ring binder and walked out. The president said we will reconvene next week. I said I want a written confirmation that no action will be taken against me. The treasurer said you will get it. I said I also want my gate access restored. The president said we will review that. I said no, I want it restored tonight. The at-large member who had spoken earlier said I agree, there is no basis for the suspension. The president sighed. He said fine, I will call the management company. I said thank you. I drove home. My gate access was restored by the time I got there. I swiped my card and the gate opened. I felt a wave of relief. I called Greg and told him what happened. He said you just ended Diane's career. I said what do you mean? He said the board cannot ignore that recording. If they do nothing, they are all liable. I said good. He said watch your back though, she is not going to let this go quietly. I said I know. The next morning I got a call from the city code enforcement supervisor. He said I have an update. I said okay. He said we completed our investigation and we found evidence that the HOA has been selectively enforcing rules on Fairway Drive in a manner that may constitute targeted harassment. I said what does that mean? He said it means we are issuing a formal warning to the HOA board and the management company. If the behavior continues, we will refer the case to the State Attorney General for further review. I said thank you. He said we are also sending a letter to all affected homeowners advising them of their rights. I said I appreciate that. He said you did the right thing by documenting everything. I said I had no choice. That afternoon I got a call from my attorney. He said the HOA's attorney called me. I said what did they want? He said they want to settle. I said settle what? He said they want to drop all fines, restore your access, and issue a formal apology in exchange for you agreeing not to file a lawsuit. I said what about Diane? He said she is being removed from the board effective immediately. I said, do I get that in writing? He said yes. I said, then I will consider it. He said, I recommend you take it. This is a good outcome. I said, okay. 2 days later, I received a letter from the HOA management company. It said all fines had been dropped, my access had been restored, and the board apologized for any inconvenience. It said Priscilla Howard was no longer serving as board secretary and would have no further role in HOA enforcement. It said the board was implementing new training on fair enforcement practices. I showed the letter to my brother. He said, does this mean it is over? I said, I think so. He said, good, I was worried. I said, me too. A week later, Greg stopped by. He said, I wanted to tell you in person. I said, tell me what? He said the board held a special meeting last night. They voted to censure Diane and remove all her committee powers. She is still a resident, but she has no authority anymore. I said, how did the vote go? He said, unanimous. Even the president voted for it. I said that as a surprise. Greg said the president knew if he protected her, the whole board would be liable. I said so, it was self-preservation. Greg said exactly. I said, what about the other homeowners on Fairway Drive? Greg said the board sent out letters apologizing and offering to waive any outstanding fines. I said that is good. Greg said you changed things. I said I just documented what was happening. Greg said most people do not do that. I said most people do not have a disabled brother depending on them. Greg nodded. He said fair point. The snow started melting the following week. The temperature stayed above freezing for 3 days straight. The plow berms turned into slush. The ice on my front steps finally broke apart. I shoveled the walkway and scattered fresh salt. I took photos out of habit. My brother asked why I was still documenting. I said because I do not trust the HOA to stay honest. He said, you think Diane will try something else? I said I do not know, but I am not taking chances. He said, you sound paranoid. I said I sound like someone who almost lost his truck and his gate access. He said, okay, fair. I saw Diane one more time. It was late March and the last of the snow had melted. I was walking to my mailbox and she was getting into her car across the street. She saw me and stopped. She did not say anything. She just stared. I stared back. Then she got in her car and drove away. Greg told me later that she put her house up for sale. He said she is moving to a different neighborhood. I said, good. He said, you really got under her skin. I said, she got under mine first. He said, true. The HOA hired a new management company in April. The new company sent out a survey asking residents about their experiences with enforcement. I filled it out. I was honest. I described the fake violations, the tow threats, the gate harassment, and the retaliation. I attached copies of all my documentation. The new management company called me a week later. The representative said, thank you for your detailed feedback. She said we are implementing new policies to prevent selective enforcement. I said, good. She said we are also creating a resident appeal process that does not require board approval. I said that would have been helpful 6 months ago. She said, I understand. She said, if you have any further issues, please contact me directly. I said, I will. By May, the neighborhood felt different. The new board president sent out a newsletter announcing changes to the covenant enforcement process. The newsletter said all violations would be reviewed by an independent third party before fines were issued. It said residents would have 30 days to appeal any violation before penalties applied. It said the board was committed to fair and transparent governance. I read the newsletter to my brother. He said, do you believe it? I said, I do not know, but at least it is in writing. He said, that is something. I said, yes, it is. I kept all my documentation in a fireproof safe. Greg asked me why I was keeping it. I said because the next board might not be as reasonable. He said, you really do not trust anyone. I said, I trust evidence. He laughed. He said, you are a financial analyst through and through. I said, that is what kept me alive. He said, fair. The following winter was different. I bought a second snow shovel and kept one in the truck and one in the garage. No one said anything. I parked in my driveway. No one left notices. I used the main gate. No one suspended my access. The new board sent out reminders about winter maintenance, but they were reasonable. No threats. No manufactured violations, just normal HOA business. Greg and I became good friends. He invited me to neighborhood events. I started attending board meetings as a regular observer. The new board was not perfect, but they were predictable. They followed the rules. They did not target people. That was all I wanted. In December, I got a letter from the City Code Enforcement Office. It said the investigation into HOA practices at Willow Creek Estates Landing had been closed with a finding of corrective action completed. It said no further enforcement was necessary. I filed the letter with the rest of my documentation. My brother asked me one night if I regretted moving to Willow Creek Estates Landing. I said no. He said even after everything with Diane. I said especially after everything with Diane. He said why? I said because I learned that documentation beats intimidation every single time. He said that is a depressing lesson. I said it is a useful lesson. He said I guess that is true. I said it is the only reason we are still here. The neighborhood is quiet now. The golf course is green in the summer and white in the winter. The HOA sends out newsletters. The board holds meetings. People complain about minor things like lawn height and mailbox paint. It is boring. It is exactly what an HOA should be. I still carry my phone everywhere. I still save every email. I still take photos of my property line after every storm. Greg says I am paranoid. I say I am prepared. He says it is the same thing. I say it is not. He says agree to disagree. I say fine. The thing people do not understand about HOA disputes is that they are not really about the rules. They are about power. Diane wanted power over me, and I would not give it to her. That was the entire conflict. The shovel, the gate code, the tow threats, the fake violations, all of it was just her trying to force compliance. When I refused and documented everything, she escalated. When I played the audio recording at the board meeting, she lost. Not because the board suddenly cared about fairness, but because I had proof that could cost them money in a lawsuit. The lesson is simple. If you live in an HOA and someone in leadership decides to target you, you have two choices. You can give in and hope they stop, or you can document everything and fight back. Giving in does not work because people like Diane do not stop. They escalate until you move or they get bored. Fighting back only works if you have evidence. Without evidence, it is your word against theirs, and they control the paperwork. I got lucky. I had a neighbor who was willing to write a statement. I had a doorbell camera. I had the discipline to document every violation and every interaction. Most people do not have all of that. Most people just get ground down and leave. That is what Diane was counting on. She thought I would be like the other homeowners on Fairway Drive who sold cheap and moved. She was wrong. The other thing people do not understand is that HOA board members are not professionals. They are volunteers with too much time and too much authority. Some of them are reasonable, some of them are petty tyrants. You do not know which kind you are dealing with until they target you. By then it is too late to prepare. You have to be ready from day one. I tell people now, if you are buying a house in an HOA, read the covenant before you close. Go to a board meeting before you sign. Talk to the neighbors. Ask if there have been any disputes. Look at the board members and ask yourself if you would trust them with power over your property. If the answer is no, walk away. It is not worth it. My brother says I am jaded. I say I am realistic. He says it is the same thing. I say it is not. We have this conversation a lot. It has been 2 years now. Diane moved away. The new board is stable. The neighborhood is boring. My brother is doing better. He finished physical therapy and he is working part-time. We still live in the same house. I still track every HOA fee and rule. I still keep my documentation in the fireproof safe. Greg asked me last week if I would ever run for the board. I said no. He said, why not? You would be good at it. I said because I do not want power, I just want to be left alone. He said that is exactly why you should run. I said no. He said think about it. I said I will not. The truth is, I do not trust myself with that kind of authority. I know what it did to Diane. I know how easy it would be to convince myself that I am enforcing rules fairly, when really I am just targeting someone I do not like. I know how power works. I do not want it. I am happy being the guy who documents everything and shows up to meetings with a folder full of evidence. That is my role. It works for me. It keeps the board honest. It keeps my brother safe. It keeps my truck in the driveway. That is enough. People ask me sometimes if I am still angry at Diane. I say no. They do not believe me. They think I must be holding a grudge. I am not. I am just careful. There is a difference. Diane was a bully with a ring binder full of highlighted rules. I was a financial analyst with a phone and a doorbell camera. She thought her position gave her power. I proved that evidence beats position every time. That is not anger. That is just math. The neighborhood is quiet now. The snow falls and melts and falls again. The HOA sends out reminders. The board holds meetings. People complain about lawn height and mailbox paint. It is boring. It is exactly what it should be. And I still carry my phone everywhere, just in case.